The air at the Miller place hung thick and still, heavy with the ghosts of 3 generations and the cloying final scent of failure. It was the smell of defeat, a mix of auctioneers' sweat, cheap cigars, and the dust kicked up by strangers' boots tramping over land that was no longer sacred. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jacket, feeling the grit of a busted hydraulic fitting under my fingernails. My own farm, or what was left of it, was 5 miles down the road, but my heart was right here, being sold off piece by piece under the indifferent August sun of 1972. This wasn't just any auction, this was a tombstone auction. Fred Miller, a good man, had chased the dream the bankers were selling. He'd signed on the dotted line for a brand new John Deere 4620 and a 6-bottom plow, believing the glossy green paint was the color of prosperity. A year later, a bad crop and a worse price, and the bank owned the paint, the steel, and the land it sat on. Now his whole life was being scattered to the 4 winds. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Fitz, with a voice like gravel in a coffee can, was working his way through the machinery line. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this fine International 856? Good rubber, runs like a top. Who'll start me at 5,000? 5,000, do I hear 5? My eyes weren't on the gleaming red tractor. They were on Richard Peterson, holding court near the front. He wasn't just a farmer, he was an empire builder, a disciple of the new religion of leverage and debt. He'd lean back, thumbs hooked in his belt, a confident smirk playing on his lips, as his man, a hired hand who did all the dirty work, would raise a finger and snatch up another piece of Fred Miller's soul. Peterson had bought the planter, the combine, and now he was looking at the 856. He already had 2 new Deeres back at his place, but for Peterson it wasn't about need. It was about conquest. He caught my eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod, the kind a king gives a peasant. I just stared back, my face a mask of stone. We'd grown up together, but we'd taken 2 different roads. My father had taught me to fear the banker's pen more than a drought or a flood. "Debt is a chain, Jed," he'd say, his voice rough from years of breathing diesel smoke and dust. "They give you just enough to move, but never enough to run." He'd died with that belief, and with his land owned by the same bank, now feasting on the Miller farm. I wasn't here for the big iron, I had my machines. They were old, paid for, and they bled oil and hydraulic fluid, but they were mine. There was the Farmall M my granddad bought new in '49, its narrow front end still tracking straight and true. There was the old Alice Chalmers Gleaner combine, the one with the grain tank on the side that made the whole machine look off balance. And then there was the heart of my operation, the beast that let me sleep at night, my 1955 Alice Chalmers HD5 crawler, a Dozer, 10 tons of pure, unadulterated American iron, powered by a screaming 2-stroke Detroit diesel engine that sounded like the world was tearing in half every time you fired it up. People laughed at it. They called it a relic, a museum piece, but that Dozer didn't need a bank loan. It ran on diesel fuel, grease, and my own sweat. It had paid for the 80 acres I'd managed to buy back, the last piece of the original stone homestead. And today, I was here for one more piece. Fitz moved on from the machinery to the land itself. Now for the real prize, gentlemen, 160 acres of prime black dirt. We'll sell it in 2 parcels. Parcel A, the front 80 with the house and barns. Parcel B, the back 80, clear to the creek. Peterson's man bought the front 80 without breaking a sweat. The price was staggering, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Peterson just smiled, signing the bank's papers on the hood of his shiny new Ford F-250. He was king of the county, and everyone knew it. Then Fitz got to the last lot of the day. It wasn't even on the sale bill. He had to clear his throat to get the crowd's attention back from the free coffee and donuts. All right, one last item, folks. The Miller estate also includes a 40-acre parcel, separate from the main farm. It's the old swamp bottom, west of the county road. Lots of rock, needs draining. We're selling it as is, where is. What am I bid? Who'll give me $100 an acre to start? Silence. The crowd shuffled. A few guys chuckled. The swamp bottom was a joke. It was where old man Miller used to push his dead trees and broken equipment. It grew cattails, mosquitoes, and fieldstone. It was 40 acres of worthless. 100 an acre, boys, that's only $4,000. Can't buy a good used pickup for that, Fitz cajoled. More silence. Peterson, standing by his truck, laughed out loud. You'd have to pay someone to take that piece of junk land, Fitz. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was it. This was the piece I'd walked 100 times as a boy. The piece that connected to my own 80. It was a mess, but it was contiguous. It was a chance. $50 an acre, I said. My voice came out low and steady, cutting through the murmurs. Every head turned. Fitz's eyes lit up. 50 I have. I've got $50 an acre from Jed Stone. Do I hear 60? $60 an acre? Peterson looked at me, his eyes wide with mock surprise. Then he let out a great booming laugh that made his cronies join in. Well, I'll be. Stoney wants the swamp. What are you going to do with that, Jed? Raise bullfrogs? Maybe you can push it all into a pile with that old yellow tractor of yours. The laughter stung, but I kept my eyes locked on the auctioneer. My jaw was set so tight I could feel the ache in my teeth. $50 an acre going once, Fitz called, his gaze sweeping the crowd. No one moved. They were all looking at me like I was a fool. Going twice. I could feel Peterson's smirk burning into the side of my face. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted everyone to see the contrast. Him, the victor, buying the best land with the bank's money, and me, the bottom feeder, scraping together cash for the county's biggest mudhole. Sold, Fitz's gavel cracked like a rifle shot, for $50 an acre to Jedediah Stone. A smattering of polite, pitying applause broke out. I walked to the clerk's table, my legs feeling strangely light. I pulled a worn canvas pouch from my inside pocket and counted out $2,000 in cash. 50s and 20s, earned from selling a few steers and working all winter fixing my neighbor's equipment, the stuff they were too proud or too busy to fix themselves. As the clerk wrote my receipt, Peterson sauntered over, his fancy leather boots silent in the dust. Jed, he said, shaking his head slowly. My daddy always told me you can't make chicken salad out of chicken manure. You just bought 40 acres of the rankest chicken manure in the state. I folded the receipt and tucked it carefully into my shirt pocket, right next to my heart. I looked him square in the eye. My daddy taught me something different, Rich. He taught me that land is land, and a man who works it with his own 2 hands and owns it free and clear is beholden to no one. He just chuckled and walked away, shaking his head. The crowd was dispersing, the vultures having picked the carcass clean. I stood there for a long moment, the sole owner of 40 worthless acres, the laughter of my neighbors still ringing in my ears. The weight of the task ahead settled on my shoulders, heavy as a winter sky. Before I tell you what I did with that dozer and that worthless piece of ground, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever owned a machine, a tool, or a truck that everyone else called junk, but you knew its true worth, the one that kept you going when everything else was falling apart? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to hear about that old, faithful iron. The first order of business was to get the HD5 over to the new property. It was too slow and too hard on the county road to drive it the 6 miles, so I had to call on the one man in the county who wasn't afraid of a challenge. Old Tom Callahan, who ran a heavy hauling business with a 1960s-era autocar truck and a lowboy trailer that had seen more battles than a 5-star general. He showed up the next morning, the big Cummins engine rumbling, and we spent the better part of an hour getting the dozer loaded. The tracks screeched and groaned as I walked it up the ramps, the steel grousers biting into the oak planks. The whole rig squatted under the 10-ton weight. Tom just chewed on his unlit cigar and watched. She's a beast, Jed, a real beast. She's honest, Tom, I said, climbing down. That's more than I can say for most things these days. We unloaded it on the shoulder of the county road bordering my new land. The moment the tracks touched that soil, it felt like I'd planted a flag. This was mine now. The work could begin. For the rest of the day, I walked every square foot of it. Peterson was right about one thing. It was a mess. The front 10 acres were a graveyard of glacial rock, granite boulders the size of small cars, left behind when the ice sheets retreated 10,000 years ago. Past that, the ground dipped into a soggy marsh, thick with cattails and reeds, buzzing with every biting insect known to man. It was waterlogged and sour. But underneath the muck, if you dug down a foot, was the same black dirt that made this county famous. It was just buried under a generation of neglect and 1,000 years of swamp. The next morning, I was there before the sun. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth. I climbed up onto the HD5 steel seat, the dew making it cold and slick. I went through the starting ritual, a liturgy I knew by heart. Fuel on, compression release levers pulled back. I hit the starter button. The pony motor, a small 2-cylinder gasoline engine, coughed to life. I let it warm up for a few minutes before engaging the pinion gear to turn over the big diesel. The sound was a high-pitched whine that echoed across the quiet fields. Then, the main event. I pushed the compression levers forward, one at a time. The first cylinder caught with a deep guttural bark. Pop. Then the second, pop. The whole machine shuddered as the 2-stroke Detroit diesel roared to life. It wasn't a rumble like a V8, it was a scream, a high-decibel angry clatter that announced its presence for miles around. Black smoke billowed from the short, straight exhaust stack before settling into a steady, hazy blue. The ground beneath the tracks vibrated. This wasn't a machine. It was a living thing. I eased the main clutch lever forward, pulled back on the left steering clutch, and the big crawler pivoted, its left track digging in, while the right one pushed forward. I pointed its 8-foot-wide blade toward the first line of rocks. I dropped the blade, the steel edge scraping against the ground, and pushed the throttle forward. The Detroit scream deepened as the governor fed it fuel. The Dozer surged forward, and the blade hit the first embedded boulder with a deafening clang that vibrated up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. The rock didn't move. The track spun, churning the soft ground into mud. I backed off, raised the blade slightly, and tried again, this time aiming for the dirt underneath the rock, trying to use the hydraulic lift and the machine's weight to pry it loose. The engine screamed in protest, the tracks dug deep, but the rock was stubborn. A granite tooth sunk deep in the jawbone of the earth. This was how the first week went. A battle of attrition. Me and the machine against the land. I learned the personality of each rock. Some you could pop out with a straight push. Others you had to dig around, undermining them until they tipped into the hole you'd made. Then you could roll them out. For the biggest ones, the ones they called prairie icebergs, I had to use every trick I knew. I'd dig a deep trench on one side, then come at it from the other, trying to get the corner of the blade under an edge. I'd put all 10 tons of the HD5's weight onto that corner, the engine at full throttle, the tracks clawing for traction, until with a great groaning tear of roots and earth, the rock would finally break free. By the end of each day, I was deaf from the engine, my bones ached from the constant jarring, and I was covered head to toe in a mixture of grease, diesel soot, and black mud. I'd drive the Dozer back to high ground, shut it down, and spend the last hour of daylight doing maintenance. I'd walk around it with a grease gun, pumping fresh lubricant into the dozens of Zerk fittings on the track rollers, idlers, and blade pivots. I'd check the oil, clean the pre-filter, and use a spade to scrape the impacted mud out of the undercarriage. Neglect that, and the mud would dry like concrete, wearing out your rollers and pins in a hurry. The whole county seemed to drive by that first month. They'd slow their pickups down, watch me fighting with a boulder for a few minutes, then shake their heads and drive on. The talk at the co-op was that Jed Stone had finally lost his mind. Paying good money for a rock quarry, I heard one of them say. Richard Peterson drove by almost daily in his air-conditioned pickup. He never waved. He'd just slow down, look at the mess of mud and rock I was creating, and that smug smile would creep across his face. He was waiting for me to fail. He was hoping for it. One afternoon, disaster struck. I was pushing a particularly nasty stump, the root ball tangled with rocks, when I felt a sudden jolt and heard a sharp crack like a pistol shot. The right track went slack, and the Dozer lurched to a stop, listing to one side. I shut her down, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. I climbed down and my heart sank. The master pin on the right track had sheared clean in half. The track was broken, lying like a dead steel snake in the mud. It was a catastrophic failure. This wasn't something you could fix with a wrench and a screwdriver. A track pin is pressed in with hundreds of tons of force. Getting a broken one out, in the middle of a muddy field, was a nightmare. There were two options. call a heavy equipment mechanic with a portable hydraulic press, which would cost hundreds of dollars I didn't have, or do it the old way, the hard way. I spent the rest of the day just getting set up. I used hydraulic jacks and oak blocks to lift the front of the dozer, taking the tension off the track. I dug the mud out from around the broken pin. The next morning, I brought out my cutting torch, a sledgehammer that weighed 20 pounds, and a hardened steel drift pin. For 6 hours, I heated the track link around the pin until it glowed cherry red. Then I'd swing that sledgehammer, driving the drift against the broken pin. The work was brutal. The sledgehammer felt like it weighed 100 pounds after the first hour. The shock of each blow traveled up the handle and into my shoulders and back. Sweat poured off me, sizzling on the hot steel. My hands were blistered and raw. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the broken pin started to move. An inch at a time, I drove it out. When the last piece finally fell to the ground with a thud, I collapsed next to the machine, my arms and back screaming in protest, too tired to even feel triumphant. It took another full day to get the new pin driven in and the track reconnected. 2 days of back-breaking labor, all for one broken pin. As I was finishing up, Peterson drove by. He stopped his truck this time, got out, and walked to the edge of the field. "Having some trouble, Stoney," he called out, a grin plastered on his face. I was too tired to be angry. I just wiped the grease from my hands onto an already blackened rag. "Just regular maintenance, Rich." "Looks a little more than regular to me," he said, gesturing at the scorched metal and the discarded sledge. "You know, for what a mechanic would have charged you, you could have made a down payment on a new machine. A machine that doesn't break down every other week." "This machine is paid for," I said, my voice flat. "Can you say the same about yours?" His grin tightened. He didn't like that. "I'm making money, Jed. Real money. While you're out here playing in the mud with your granddaddy's toys. You're a relic, just like that piece of junk. The world's passing you by." He got back in his truck and spun his tires in the gravel as he pulled away, leaving me alone in the quiet field with my old, broken but wholly owned machine. The years began to blur into a rhythm of seasons and sweat. From 1972 into the mid-70s, the world of farming was on fire. Russia had a bad harvest, and suddenly they were buying American grain by the boatload. The price of corn went from $1.50 a bushel to $3, then $4. Soybeans shot through the roof. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. And Richard Peterson was getting big. He was the poster child for the new era. He used his ever-increasing land equity as collateral for bigger and bigger loans from the bank and the Production Credit Association. He bought the 120 acres south of him when the old widow Henderson finally sold out. He traded in his nearly new John Deere 4430s for the brand new 4640s, the ones with the sound guard body, a fancy name for a quiet cab with a radio and air conditioning. He bought a monstrous International 1486, its turbo whining like a jet engine as it pulled a 24-foot disc. His operation was a sight to behold, a fleet of new, powerful machines rolling across 1,000 acres of the best land in the county. He put up 2 giant blue harvester silos that became landmarks, symbols of his success that you could see for miles. When folks at the diner talked about farming, they talked about Richard Peterson. He was smart, aggressive, a real go-getter. He was the future, and then there was me. By 1975, I had finally finished my 40-acre project. The rocks were gone, piled into a massive wall along the property line that would stand for 1,000 years. I'd spent a whole summer with the dozer, cutting a deep drainage ditch along the low side, a 12-foot deep trench that bled the swamp dry. The cattails died, the ground hardened, and after a year of letting it settle and working it with a disc, the sour smell was gone. What was left was 40 acres of the richest, blackest soil you've ever seen. Virgin ground, full of life. I planted it with an old 4-row John Deere 7000 planter I'd bought for cash at a farm sale, pulling it with my trusty Farmall M. My yields on that 40 were the best in the county, but it was still just 40 acres. I was a small fry, a hobby farmer in the eyes of men like Peterson. I took the profits from those first few good years and, instead of buying a new tractor, I bought another piece of unwanted land, a 20-acre triangle of pasture that was too hilly for the big equipment to farm efficiently. I paid cash. Peterson actually stopped by one day while I was fixing the fence on that new piece. He leaned against his shiny truck, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Jed, I don't get you," he said. "The price of corn is $4. You could be making a fortune. Why are you wasting your time with these little junk parcels?" "It's what I can afford, Rich," I said, stretching a new strand of barbed wire with a fence stretcher. "Afford? Jed, the bank is practically giving money away. You've got this land, it's worth a fortune now. You could borrow against it, buy a real farm, buy some real equipment." "I don't like borrowing," I said simply. He threw his hands up in exasperation. "You're living in the past. This is the new way. You use the bank's money to make more money. It's simple. Look, I'll make you an offer. I'll buy all your little pieces. This one, the swamp bottom, your original 80. I'll give you a fair price. Enough for you to go get a nice house in town, a steady job, put you out of your misery." I stopped my work and looked at him. He was serious. He truly believed he was doing me a favor. "This isn't misery, Rich. This is my life, and it's not for sale." He shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "Suit yourself. But don't come crying to me when you get left behind for good." He drove off, and I went back to stretching my wire. But his words echoed what everyone else was thinking. I was a failure, a man stuck in the past, too scared or too stupid to grab the brass ring that was being offered. The commodity prices stayed high, the land values kept climbing, and the banks kept lending. It felt like the good times would never end. But I was starting to notice things. The price of diesel fuel had doubled. A bag of seed corn cost 30% more than it did 2 years ago. The price of a new tractor tire was astronomical. At the co-op, I'd listened to the older guys, the ones who had farmed through the Depression. They'd watch the young guys signing loan papers for a new combine, and they'd shake their heads. "Trees don't grow to the sky," old man Hemmings would mutter into his coffee. One evening in the late 70s, I was listening to the radio in my small house, a broadcast from Chicago. The announcer was talking about inflation, about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker being appointed chairman. He was talking about interest rates and how they might have to go up, way up, to stop the economy from overheating. Outside, a storm was brewing on the western horizon. The air grew heavy and electric. I stood on my porch and watched the lightning flicker in the distance, illuminating the underside of the dark, anvil-shaped clouds. I looked across the road at Peterson's empire, his 2 blue silos standing like twin towers against the bruised purple sky. A feeling of deep unease settled in my gut. The wind was starting to pick up, and it smelled like rain. It smelled like change. The storm of 1978 didn't arrive with a polite warning. It came like a thief in the night, a brutal, straight-line wind that the Weather Service later called a derecho. I was woken by the sound of my old farmhouse groaning, the windows rattling in their frames as if a giant hand were trying to shake the building apart. The rain wasn't falling, it was being driven sideways, a solid sheet of water that sounded like gravel being thrown against the siding. I stood in the dark living room, watching the ancient oaks in my yard bend until their tops nearly touched the ground, and I thought, this is different. This is a killing wind. When dawn broke, the world was remade in shades of green and brown. The sky was a strange, bruised yellow. My corn was flat, not just bent, but snapped and broken at the stalk. A total loss. The roof was missing shingles, and a massive limb from one of the oaks had crushed a section of fence. But the house stood. The barn stood. The old machines, sitting solid and low to the ground, were untouched. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my gut for the lost crop, but beneath it, a bedrock of relief. I had lost a year's income, not the farm itself. I drove into town for supplies later that morning, and that's when I saw the true devastation. The path of the storm had passed directly over Richard Peterson's grand enterprise. His huge machine shed, a modern pole building with sheet metal sides, was a twisted wreck. The wind had peeled the roof off and collapsed the walls inward, damaging the $1 million worth of new equipment parked inside. But the worst of it was the silos. The 2 gleaming blue harvestors, those monuments to leverage and progress, were grievously wounded. The wind had ripped open the seams on the western-facing sides, and the silage inside, now exposed to the air, was already beginning to spoil. The acrid, sweet smell of fermenting ruin hung over his property like a shroud. The talk at the co-op was hushed and grim. Peterson was facing a catastrophic loss. The insurance would cover some of it, they said, but not the lost feed, not the downtime, not the sheer, overwhelming cost of the cleanup and repair. I saw him there a week later. He wasn't the confident king anymore. His face was pale, his eyes were hollow, and he moved like a man carrying an invisible weight. He was on the phone with the dealer, his voice tight with frustration. "What do you mean you can't get the parts for the 1486? It's harvest time. I've got beans in the field right now that survived, and I can't get them out." His problems were a web of modern complexity. His combine had been damaged in the shed collapse, a sophisticated electronic component in the grain monitor was fried, and the part was on backorder. His biggest tractor had a hydraulic pump failure, and the dealer mechanic was 2 weeks out. He was machinery-rich and operationally paralyzed. He was a general with a high-tech army that had run out of ammunition. Meanwhile, I was in my fields. Not harvesting, there was nothing to harvest, but cleaning up. I fired up the old HD5, the Detroit screaming its defiant song, and started pushing the downed trees and debris into piles to be burned. The Dozer didn't care about the storm. It was too heavy, too simple, too brutally honest to be bothered by the wind. Later that fall, I took on custom work, clearing fence rows and digging ponds for neighbors who had also suffered damage. That old crawler, the one Peterson had mocked, was bringing in cash while his new iron sat broken and silent. The first cracks in his empire weren't just the visible damage from the storm, they were in the numbers nobody saw. The price of diesel fuel kept climbing. Fertilizer prices shot up, and the whispers from the radio about Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve grew louder. Interest rates, the lifeblood of Peterson's operation, were beginning to tick upward. First 9%, then 10, then 12. Each percentage point was another turn of the screw, another drop of blood squeezed from an operation that had zero margin for error. The world that had made Richard Peterson a king was beginning to turn on him. He had built a beautiful, gleaming castle on a foundation of cheap debt, and that foundation was quietly turning to sand. The turn of the decade felt like a page being ripped out of a book. By 1981, the word inflation was on everyone's lips, and the Federal Reserve's cure felt worse than the disease. The prime interest rate, the number the banks based everything on, didn't just rise, it skyrocketed. 15%, 18%. It finally peaked at an unbelievable 21.5%. For farmers like Richard Peterson, who had built their empires on variable rate operating loans, it was a death sentence. A loan that was manageable at 8% became an anchor that would drag you to the bottom at 20%. The math was simple and brutal. The interest on Peterson's debt was now more than he could ever hope to gross from his crops, even in a perfect year. And these were not perfect years. To fight inflation, the government had also slapped a grain embargo on the Soviet Union. Our biggest customer was gone overnight. The price of corn collapsed, falling back to $2 a bushel. High interest rates, high input costs, and low commodity prices. It was the perfect storm of economic devastation. The farm crisis had arrived. The auction notices started appearing in the weekly paper like obituaries. First it was the young guys, the ones who had just gotten started. Then it was the established names, families who had been on their land for 100 years. Every Saturday, it seemed, another farm was being sold on the courthouse steps. The mood in the county was one of quiet, desperate fear. The banks, the same ones that had pushed the loans so eagerly just a few years before, were now cold and unforgiving. They wanted their money, and they didn't care that they were tearing the heart out of the community to get it. I survived. It wasn't easy. The low prices hurt me just like everyone else, but I had no debt. My property taxes were my biggest bill. I didn't need to make $100,000 just to pay the interest. I needed to make enough to buy fuel, seed, and groceries. I tightened my belt. I ate what I grew in my garden. I patched my clothes and welded my own equipment. My old, paid-for machinery became my salvation. When my Alice Chalmers combine broke down, I didn't have to call a dealer. I had a spare parts machine I'd bought for $50, and I spent 2 days in the field with a set of wrenches, swapping out the broken gearbox myself. The total cost was my own sweat and a few gallons of diesel. My neighbors, trapped with their newer, more complicated machines, weren't so lucky. Their repair bills were astronomical. More and more, they started coming to me. "Jed, can you take a look at my planter? The dealer wants $500 just to come out." "Jed, you still got that welder? I've got a crack in the frame of my disc." I never charged them much, just enough to cover my time and materials. It felt wrong to profit from their misery, but the work kept my lights on and put food on my table. The old skills my father had taught me, the ones the new generation had dismissed as obsolete, were now more valuable than ever. The inevitable day came in the spring of 1983. The notice was in the paper, a full-page ad. The Peterson Farm. Foreclosure auction. All land, machinery, and personal property to be sold to the highest bidder. It was the biggest bust the county had ever seen. I went to the auction. I had to. It felt like closing a circle that had started at the Miller sale over a decade earlier. The crowd was huge, but the atmosphere was funereal. No one was excited. These were not vultures circling. They were fellow farmers, all of them just a few bad months away from the same fate, come to watch the fall of a giant. Richard Peterson was there, standing beside his wife near the porch of the beautiful brick house his grandfather had built. He was a ghost. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed resignation. He looked 10 years older. He had lost everything. The 1,000 acres he had amassed, the new equipment, the blue silos, which now stood scarred and half-empty, it was all being picked apart by the bank. The auctioneer, the same man, Fitz, seemed to have no joy in his work today. His voice lacked its usual snap. He sold the big new tractors first. They went for pennies on the dollar. The market was flooded with used equipment from other farm failures. A 3-year-old John Deere 4640 that Peterson had paid $60,000 for sold for $15,000. Each crack of the gavel was another nail in his coffin. Then they came to the land. They sold it off parcel by parcel. The outfarms went first, bought up by an investment company from the city. Finally, they came to the last piece. Parcel A, the original 80-acre homestead with the house, the barns, and the family history. "All right, folks," Fitz said, his voice weary. "The home place. What am I bid?" An awful silence fell over the crowd. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. Peterson's wife, Sarah, finally broke, burying her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. Richard just stood there, his face a mask of stone, staring at the ground. The banker, a slick young man in a suit that looked out of place in the dusty farmyard, stepped forward. "We have an opening bid from the bank for $100,000 to protect our interest." "100,000 from the bank," Fitz repeated, his voice flat. "Do I hear 105? More silence. This was it. The final indignity. The bank would take it all. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had spent the last 10 years saving every penny I could, living frugally, preparing for a rainy day. I never knew what I was saving for. But now I did. 101,000, I said. My voice was clear and steady. Every head whipped around to look at me. The banker glared. Richard Peterson looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I have 101 from Jed Stone," Fitz announced, a flicker of life returning to his voice. The banker, annoyed, immediately shot back. 102. 103, I said without hesitating. We went back and forth like that, me in $1,000 increments, him in single thousands, his frustration growing with every bid. The crowd was mesmerized. Jed Stone, the man everyone had called a fool, was going toe-to-toe with the bank for the Peterson homestead. When the bidding reached 120,000, the banker conferred with his superior on his car phone, then shook his head. He was done. $120,000, Fitz called out, his eyes on me. Going once? Going twice? He looked at the stunned crowd, at the broken man on the porch, at the banker shaking his head in disgust. Sold for $120,000 to Jedediah Stone. A wave of murmurs washed through the crowd. I walked to the clerk's table, my heart pounding not with triumph, but with the immense weight of what I had just done. I wrote the check from my savings account, an account built on cash from custom Dozer work, from selling a few steers, from a decade of saying no to the temptations of debt. When I was done, I walked over to Richard. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the house, his house, that I now owned. "Why, Jed," he finally whispered, his voice cracking, "after everything, after how I treated you, why?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see an arrogant rival. I saw a neighbor. I saw a farmer who had loved the land just as much as I did, but had gone about it the wrong way. Because nobody should have to see their granddaddy's house sold off to a man in a suit who's never set foot in a field, I said quietly. "This place belongs to a Peterson." I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket. It was a simple rental agreement I'd had my lawyer draw up the day before, just in case. "I'll rent the house and barns to you for $1 a year. You farm the 80 acres for me on shares. We'll split the profit 50-50. You can live here as long as you want. Maybe someday you can buy it back." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears. He couldn't speak. He just reached out and took the paper, his hand trembling. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his head that carried the weight of a decade of pride, failure, and now an unimaginable flicker of hope. He had lost his empire, but I had just given him back his home. The years that followed were quiet and healing. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip, and the county began to breathe again, though it was forever changed. Many families were gone for good, their names fading from the mailboxes. But a new kind of farming began to emerge, one that was leaner, more cautious, and deeply skeptical of debt. Richard Peterson became my partner, and in time, my friend. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence and a hard-won humility. He was a good farmer, a brilliant farmer, once he was freed from the crushing weight of interest payments. We worked the land together, my original 80, the swamp bottom, and his ancestral home place. We used my old, reliable equipment and his deep knowledge of modern agronomy. We made a good team. He never did buy the farm back. He said he preferred it this way. It was a daily reminder of the lesson he had learned. My reputation in the community changed. I was no longer Jed Stone, the eccentric relic with his old Dozer. I was the man who had seen the storm coming. I was the man who had survived. Younger farmers would stop by, not to laugh, but to ask for advice. "How do you know when a machine is worth fixing?" they'd ask. "How do you get by without an operating loan?" I'd always give them the same answer, the one my father gave me. "You own what you can pay for. You fix what's broken with your own two hands, and you fear the banker's pen more than you fear a drought. The weather can only take your crop. The bank can take your legacy." I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled and stiff, scarred with the memory of 1,000 repairs. My son runs the farm, and he does it with a mix of the old ways and the new. He uses a computer to track his markets, but he still knows how to overhaul the engine on the Farmall M. My grandson, a boy of 10 with my father's eyes, loves the old machines best. His favorite is the HD5. It sits retired now, parked in the spot of honor by the barn, its yellow paint faded, its steel tracks resting in the grass. It doesn't work much anymore, but I start it up a few times a year just to hear that Detroit diesel scream. The other day, my grandson climbed up onto the steel seat. He looked so small up there. He put his hands on the control levers. "Grandpa," he asked, his voice full of a child's simple wonder, "was this tractor a good one?" I looked at the old crawler, at the dents in its blade from the rocks it had moved, at the welds on the track frame from the pin I had replaced under a hot summer sun. I looked out across my land, the rolling 80 my family had settled, the 40 acres of black dirt I had carved from a swamp, and across the road, the Peterson place, its brick house solid and secure. All of it held together by the simple, stubborn philosophy embodied in that 10-ton machine. "Yeah," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "It was an honest machine. It never promised more than it could deliver, and it never cost more than I could pay. It was the best tractor a man could ever own." The boy smiled, not fully understanding, but sensing the truth in my words. In the distance, I could hear the sound of my son's modern tractor working in the field, its engine a quiet hum. A different sound, from a different time, but the land was the same. the lessons I hoped would endure. The wind whispered through the tall oak trees, carrying the scent of rich soil and the promise of another season, another generation, on a farm that had been bought and paid for, not with borrowed money, but with sweat, patience, and the unyielding roar of old American iron.